Well, good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar. We're very pleased to come to you on an almost weekly basis from the Wilson Center and the National History Center to talk about historical perspectives on international and national affairs. This afternoon, we will focus on divisions, a new history of racism and resistance in America's World War II military, a new book by historian Thomas Guglielmo. Tom, congrats and welcome to the Washington History Seminar. We're also very fortunate to have with us Professor Adrian Smith and Professor Takashi Fujitani, both of whom will provide initial comments and launch our debate. To both of you, a warm welcome to the Washington History Seminar as well. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center, and I have the privilege to co-chair the seminar series with Eric Arnesen of the National History Center and George Washington University. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion today. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative of two organizations, the National History Center of the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. Over the last decade or so, the seminar has served as a nonpartisan forum to discuss important new historical findings, insights, and publications. Prior to the pandemic, we met on a weekly basis at the Wilson Center, but we've been very pleased to come to you via Zoom and Facebook since last summer, and we're delighted that so many more people have been able to participate in these sessions. Behind the scenes, two individuals helped produce this event, Rachel Wheatley for the National History Center and Pete Bierstecker at the Wilson Center. Our thanks to both of them. We'd like to acknowledge our supporters and we welcome your support. Details on how to support this seminar are available in the chat right now or simply go to our institutional websites. A quick explanation on the procedure this afternoon. Today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A part of the session, you have three options to join. You can use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality if you would like to ask a question. Once you press the button, you'll be entered into a queue. When the moderator calls on you, you will receive a prompt that will ask you to unmute your screen. Please press yes, and then hopefully we will be able to hear you. You can start getting in line even before the discussion period. That's our preferred way for you to join us. You can also use the chat function, the Q&A function in the Zoom functionality, in my case at the top of the screen, it may be elsewhere for you. And you can also email us, email Rachel Wheatley if you're listening to us or following us on Facebook Live. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric. Eric, Zoom is yours.
Thank you, Christian. It is my genuine pleasure to introduce our author today, Thomas Guglielmo, who is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of American Studies, not to mention my colleague, at the George Washington University here in the nation's capital. Tom received his PhD in history from the University of Michigan, and his previous book, White on Arrival, Italians, Race, Color, and Power in Chicago, 1890 to 1940, published in 2003, won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award of the American Organization of American Historians and the Allen Nevin Prize from the Society of American Historians. Today, he will be speaking on his newest book, Divisions, A New History of Racism and Resistance in America's World War II Military, published by Oxford University Press at the start of this month. I will confess at the outset that I've been looking forward to seeing this book in print for a number of years, and I am absolutely delighted that Tom is here to talk about it this afternoon. Tom, the Zoom screen is yours.
Thanks so much, Eric. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Eric Arnesen, Rachel Wheatley, Christian Osterman, and everyone else who helped to organize this great event. Thanks to Professors Adrian Smith and Takashi Fujitani for taking time out of their busy days, busy schedules to engage with my work. And thanks to everybody here who is attending. I am really, really appreciative. After working on this book for more many more years than I would care to admit. It's fantastic to have the chance to finally talk to people about it. So I've been asked to speak very briefly and to lay out the main arguments of the book, and so I'll do that. But I just want to start by start with two individual stories as a way of personalizing some of the book's broad themes. But my talk will come in four main parts. It'll be a short, I hope, a short talk, four main parts: vignettes, racism, resistance, and aftermaths. I have a very brief PowerPoint that'll only, I'll show just for the first section of this, my remarks. Yeah, okay, great. So again, I'll have four quick parts: vignettes, racism, resistance, and aftermaths. Vignettes. Winfred Lynn. This is a photograph of Winfred Lynn in around 1944. Winfred Lynn was once a household name in some circles in World War II America. A national civil rights group bore his name. Newspapers sang his praises. Pamphlets and radio shows told his story. Cocktail parties were held to raise money for his cause. A 36-year-old landscape gardener from Queens, New York, Lynn refused to be drafted into the segregated US Army in 1942. In time, he was convinced to join up, and he rose to the rank of sergeant, serving in a medical sanitary company in the Pacific. But even while in uniform, he never gave up on his battle against Jim Crow in uniform. He staged sit-down strikes, he circulated protest petitions, and he served as the plaintiff in a civil rights case that reached the US Supreme Court in 1944. A decade before Brown v. Board of Education, his case challenged state-sanctioned racial segregation in the Army and in the draft. Although he lost this case, his activism, I would argue, contributed to the post-war desegregation of the military and to the post-war Black civil rights movement. Yasugo Kadomiya. This is from about 1945. Yasugo Kadomiya, born on Bainbridge Island in the state of Washington, joined the Army on his 26th birthday, January 13th, 1942. What his experiences were like in uniform are sadly largely unknown to us, except that on August 7th, 1943, he and 5 other Japanese American soldiers stationed in Wyoming wrote a letter to Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson. They wished to renounce their US citizenship and expatriate to Japan. When the Army investigated the men's requests, Kadomiya explained, quote, "On several occasions in the United States Army, I have been referred by officers as a goddamn Jap. An officer once told me that it is a disgrace to the United States to permit a Jap to wear a uniform," end of quote. No doubt the other racist restrictions placed on Japanese American soldiers at the time, their mandatory movement inland, their constant surveillance, their loss of arms and so forth, no doubt these additional racist restrictions infuriated this willful, proud, and principled young man. In any case, the Army rejected his and the other requests, but punished him just the same. It transferred him to a hard labor battalion for what the Army called the potentially subversive. It forced him to conduct menial tasks for the rest of the war, and it eventually discharged him less than honorably, which restricted his access to invaluable GI Bill benefits just as he was getting married and starting a family. Yasugo Kadomiya is my wife's grandfather. So that's part one, vignettes. I'm gonna stop sharing. Part two, racism. As Winfred Lynn and Yasugo Kadomiya could tell you, the US military was a sprawling structure of white supremacy. That is, the US military offered a grossly disproportionate share of power and prestige to those who could claim status as white. In comparison to all other people, whites had a much easier time joining the military or a particular branch or service in the military. They had a much easier time breaking into the officer ranks and rising within them, a much easier time occupying all the highest positions of authority, receiving skilled, well-paid work and promotions, enjoying adequate recreational facilities, fighting in combat and receiving the honor that came along with it, getting a fair shake in the military's criminal justice system, winning awards and decorations, and being discharged honorably, on time, and with access to invaluable GI Bill benefits. So the military, again, was this, as I said, a sprawling structure of white supremacy that had all kinds of elements, all of which greatly advantaged people who could claim status as white. But who were these white people exactly? And if their lives in the military had countless advantages, in relation to whom did they enjoy them? Now, this is where the answer is complicated, since the military had multiple crisscrossing color lines, not just one. And these many color lines defined whites and everyone else in various ways. The military's most important racist division split colored, what was called colored from white, or in today's terms, black from white. Colored included anyone who was Negro or part Negro, that is, anyone who had any discernible trace of Negro ancestry. But the all-important white category was a moving target. At its most inclusive, it corralled anyone who was not Black, creating what some scholars today call a Black, non-Black line. In these cases, the power of the Black-white divide trumped, blurred, and even sometimes dissolved other color lines. It transformed Japanese Americans, even Yasugo Kadomiya at times. It transformed Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Puerto Ricans, and others into white insiders of a sort. One 1940 War Department memo regarding who could join white military units, for example, held that, quote, trainees of all races other than Negro will be assigned the same as white trainees, end of quote. But note the language here. Some of those, quote, races other than Negro were not exactly white, but would be assigned to outfits as if they were. Here then is a sign that the military established additional racist divisions. The most important of these were various versions of a white, non-white line. These divides were less widespread and less institutionalized than the Black-white ones, but at times they nonetheless narrowed the category of white to include at its most exclusive only those of supposed pure European descent. This meant that groups like Asian Americans, Latin Americans, and Native Americans zigged and zagged between whiteness, non-whiteness, and nominal whiteness, between insider, outsider, and a murky middle ground. None of these groups moved more frequently or more dramatically than Japanese Americans, thanks to their supposed ties to America's enemy in the Pacific. In fact, racist assumptions about those ties sometimes led to exclusions of Japanese Americans alone, what I would call a Japanese non-Japanese line. This boundary appears most obvious in the Navy's outright ban of all Japanese Americans throughout the war. Overall, then, the military's complex of color lines constituted not simply a sprawling structure of white supremacy, it was also a structure of Black subordination and often Japanese American and other non-white subordination as well. Now, there was nothing static or inevitable about this structure. Some color lines originated during World War II in response to its twists and its turns. But even those lines that long predated World War II, especially Black-white lines, had to be recreated affirmatively and continually throughout the conflict. In time, thanks to many factors, The white-non-white divide generally blurred over the course of the war, often a fair amount. To a lesser but nonetheless important extent, the black-white divide did so as well, especially in the war's final year or so, and especially overseas. Erecting these divides was a group effort. If some ordinary white people, both in and out of uniform, proved enthusiastic builders, more powerful architects had the most say in the matter, especially the on-the-ground commanders and War and Navy Department leaders. With a few important exceptions, the White House, Congress, and the courts, including the Supreme Court, supported these leaders implicitly or explicitly all along the way. At the same time, liberals in Congress managed to pass a clause in the 1940 Selective Training and Service Act, so the main selective service legislation during World War II. And this law contained a seemingly straightforward and sweeping civil rights clause. And here's what it said, quote, "In the selection and training of men under this act, and in the interpretation and execution of the provisions of this act, there shall be no discrimination against any person on account of race or color," end of quote. Had the military followed the letter of the law, or had the White House or the courts forced it to do so, as Winfred Lynn's case attempted to accomplish, America's World War II armed forces would have been far more egalitarian. But virtually no one in the federal government showed any interest in enforcing this portion of the law. Military leaders and their supporters built color lines for one inescapable, seemingly paradoxical reason. Winning the war for 4 freedoms, in their view, required unfreedoms. Leaders claimed repeatedly, for example, that the morale, efficiency, and discipline of US troops, by which they invariably meant white US troops, that the morale, efficiency, and discipline of troops demanded the black-white divide. The implication was that whites would otherwise be too consumed by anti-black resentments and conflict to invest their all in the war effort. The white-black divide, from this perspective, was a wartime imperative, a precondition for victory. This argument was a damning admission about the depths of the nation's anti-black racism, and it painted a picture of the wartime military that contrasted sharply with popular notions about unity. But truthfully, the black-white divide had more to do with leaders' own investments in white domination and black subordination. Both, they seemed to believe in their bones, were natural, essential, and virtuous features of American life. When the military itself proved at times to threaten these features, no matter how unwittingly, leaders redoubled their efforts to shore these lines up. Toward war's end, this white supremacist consensus showed cracks among some military leaders, especially in the Navy, but other leaders clung to this consensus tenaciously through victory and beyond. The white, non-white, and Japanese, non-Japanese lines stemmed in part from their own particular logics. At times, military leaders also viewed these lines as essential to the war effort, none more so than when Japanese Americans and issues of national security were involved. At other times, however, these leaders also viewed impermeable white, non-white, and Japanese, non-Japanese divides as war effort liabilities, as things that could actually hurt America's war effort. They felt these lines damaged America's ties to its so-called darker allies abroad and confirmed Axis propagandists' claims about the United States race war for white supremacy. Of course, Black activists and their allies made some of these same points about the Black-white divide, but to little avail. Nearly all of the military's brass viewed bright black-white lines as an undisputed war imperative. By contrast, the value of white, non-white, and Japanese, non-Japanese lines was more contingent, varying somewhat depending on the time, the context, and the people in question. Part 3, resistance. These efforts to draw color lines are only half the story. The military's purpose in building these lines was often defensive. It sought to shore them up against Black people's and others' constant efforts to rewrite or remove them. Furthermore, to the extent that these boundaries shifted or blurred over the course of the war, bottom-up struggles deserve a good deal of credit. And yet we don't have a good understanding, in my view at least, of the role of the military, and especially of troops themselves in civil rights histories. Wide-ranging battles against the military's racist divisions constitute a vital chapter in modern America's freedom struggles. And these struggles were plural. Just as distinct color lines wended their way throughout the military, distinct movements also arose in response. The largest of these movements involved Black troops and an impressive array of allies, including Black newspapers, civil rights organizations, labor unions, religious groups, and troops' families and loved ones. Their primary target was the military's manifold Black-white lines, or color lines altogether. The troops themselves tended to focus on racism, most common in their day-to-day lives in uniform. So for example, anything involving rank and promotion and jobs and recreation. Their allies supported them in these battles, but they also took the lead on broader policy fights about equal access to the military and to its desegregation. Black activists and their supporters employed the broadest range of protest styles and tactics, including letter writing, petitions, lobbying, voting, litigation, heroic soldiering, boycotts, marches, strikes, sit-ins, and armed self-defense. They tried their best as soldiers, hoping that heroic service in uniform might finally secure for them some semblance of fairness and decency and respect. And they tried their least, convinced that no amount of sacrifice in uniform would uproot Jim Crow. Overcoming opposition in the White House, in Congress, in the courts, and in the military, Black struggles scored a few wartime victories. They helped to integrate some training camps, some military recreational spaces, and even some fighting units in Western Europe at the tail end of the war. They also forever transformed conversations about military racism. A fringe position at the start of the war, support for integrated military outfits became a thoroughly mainstream one in progressive circles only a few short years later. President Truman often receives credit for the post-war desegregation of the US Armed Forces, but activist Black GIs and their allies deserve their fair share. Facing their own set of military color lines involving bans on their enlistment, segregation, surveillance, and so forth, Japanese Americans and their allies also fought to resist and to rewrite these color lines. A small subset, or most famously, this involved highly decorated military service, but it involved more than that as well. A small subset of Japanese Americans also made their compliance with induction conditional on their receiving just compensation, that is, reparations for the wrongs of mass removal and mass incarceration. Some Japanese Americans also fought both voluntary enlistment and compulsory conscription, demanded repatriation and expatriation, like Yasugo Kadomiya, and renounced their US citizenship. In the end, Japanese Americans' wartime struggle against military racism succeeded at greatly expanding their Army enlistment numbers, assigning larger numbers of Japanese Americans to so-called white outfits, and helping to blur numerous color lines in uniform. There were also miscellaneous struggles or moments of struggle. Perhaps the most important of these involved an assorted collection of people whose official racial designation was the subject of great debate between the military and the men themselves. In many of these cases, the men who might have identified as Indian, Creole, Puerto Rican, Moorish American, and more, in many of these cases, these men fought most fervently to be not Black, since it was that category that occupied the most dangerous and debilitating side of the military's most foundational racist divides. This point reminds us that these struggles against military racism were as varied as the racism itself. Some people wish to keep color lines in place, but simply to relocate themselves or perhaps their fellows in relation to those lines. Others wish to blur some color lines, but not other ones. And still others fought to eliminate color lines altogether. In part because of these varied forms of racism and varied responses, civil rights struggles seldom intersected. Now, sometimes they did, to be sure, especially among the military's two most subordinated groups, African Americans and Japanese Americans. Sometimes non-whites or borderline whites expressed affinities for one another or joined forces in impromptu battles against white racism. Sometimes they even collaborated more formally, as when the National Committee to Abolish Segregation in the Armed Services, which was a group that formed in the end of the war, 1945, decried military segregation and discrimination aimed not simply at Black soldiers, but also against what they called soldiers of other minority groups, Negro, Mexican, Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese. So there were moments of cooperation, but more frequently, the military's multiple lines served to fracture its ranks. They impeded efforts both during the war and long after to build broad-based solidarities as, say, quote, darker races, as workers, as veterans, or as Americans. Finally, aftermaths, part 4. As this last point suggests, the call and response of military racism and resistance discussed here cast a long and speckled shadow over post-war American life, one that has not been fully examined or understood. On the one hand, this call and response of racism and resistance convinced a growing number of American veterans to democratize the nation, invigorating a range of existing freedom struggles and laying the foundation for important civil rights victories to come, beginning with the desegregation of the military itself. We tend to know this story, I think. On the other hand, the military's color lines also undermined these efforts to build a more egalitarian nation. They traumatized, even killed an unknowable number of non-white troops. They further naturalized the very idea of race, made it that much more commonsensical to people. They deepened many whites' investments in white supremacy, especially anti-Black racism, and they further fractured the American people and their politics, divisions. And lost in this fracturing was a simple but profound truth. Military racism spared no one, or nearly no one. To varying degrees, African Americans, Japanese Americans, and other non-whites suffered immensely during World War II, and their harms lasted well into the post-war years. But white people also paid a price, sometimes the ultimate price. Racist barriers in enlistment and elsewhere ensured whites' overrepresentation among those who served in World War II, fought on the front lines, and died. Viewed this way, military racism crowned few true victors. So it has been with all forms of racism, past and present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Our first discussant today is Takashi Fujitani, who holds the David Chu Chair in Asian Pacific Studies at the University of Toronto, where he is also Professor of History and Director of the Dr. David Chu Program in Asia Pacific Studies. He received his PhD from the Department of History at the University of California, Berkeley, and his major works include Splendid Monarchy, published in 1996 by the University of California Press, Race for Empire, Koreans as Japanese and Japanese as Americans During World War II, published in 2011, and Perilous Memories, The Asia-Pacific Wars, co-edited and published by Duke University Press in 2001. He is editor of the book series Asia-Pacific Modern, University of California Press, and has held numerous grants and fellowships, including from the John S. Guggenheim Foundation. Takashi, the Zoom room is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for that reminder and for so much else, but especially for the opportunity to have an early read of Tom's fantastic book and then to be able to comment it along with Adrian and also all the people who are looking in today. There's a lot to say in limited time, so I'd like to focus really on the larger structure and analysis of the book, and especially this kind of way in which white supremacy in the military work through the division, not only white against non-white, but white, black, and then non-black minority. It's really more of a tripartite kind of moving scheme, and I want to say something about that and its implications for us today, right now. How it is so important in thinking through concerns about racism, rising racism today across the broad spectrum of basically all the people that Tom has written about. But before doing that, I just want to acknowledge first that the book is really a product of tremendous labor and brilliance. You really get a sense of that, not only from reading the text, but from looking at the citations. I think it's about 100 pages of notes in this book. So, that's just a very general point about the research that has gone into it. But but we can talk perhaps something later about the challenges in the research that was conducted here. I also want to say that I don't think there's another book that's as sweeping in its analysis of racism within the US military during the Second World War. There are books and numerous articles and book chapters that, of course, focus on one or another of the racialized groups. And then there are more broad, sweeping statements about race, but without the kind of a detailed description of each of the different groups involved, and then the shifting policies in the military. In a sense, the racism within the military that military during World War II that Tom describes seems to be, in his words, he calls it bewildering. And if we look at the 1940 Selective Training and Service Act, STSA, there were 5 races, as he shows us: white, Negro, Oriental, Indian, and Filipino. Those are basically the 5. And then if we think also about the 1940 census, at the time was somewhat similar, slightly different. It's again, the 3 categories: white, Negro, and Indian, American Indian, that is, that are consistent, but the others are just a kind of a mix: Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Hindu, Korean. So on the surface, it looks bewildering in Tom's term, but I think we might as well also call it a kind of incoherent racism. But I think Tom's contribution is really to put all the thousands of sources that he's found, and he's looked at all the different contradictions involved to demonstrate that, as incoherent as they might seem, there is a kind of white supremacist rationality in it. And I don't know if he would agree with the term rationality, but I think there is that sort of structure that he shows us. What he says in my reading is what Du Bois called the color line operated most starkly and rigidly in the boundary between whites and blacks. These are descriptors of color. Although he shows us the determination of what constituted whiteness or blackness was not always consistent and not always biological or phenotypical in any way. But in any way, it used the language of color. But what are we to make of the other categories of the STSA? Oriental, Indian, and Filipino. we can think of the American Indian as a special category, of course, of the indigenous people, but why was not the Filipino included in the Oriental and so on? So these are quite sort of on the surface illogical or categories that seem somewhat arbitrary. So it seems, in other words, that there was a color-coded confidence about dividing white from black, but there was not the category, for instance, of yellow, another color category, but many micro categories that were used. While we might think of these as haphazard or incoherent, Tom shows that for the white supremacist regime, there was a kind of basic structural logic. And this is the logic that I think his making visible to us is really useful for thinking through historically and in our present moments. So he has the category of white and black with a very solid kind of boundary between those two. And then not just non-white minority, but rather more importantly, he shows, and I think this is unique, non-black minority. So there was a kind of separation of minorities who were not black from the really radically abjected group, the black minority. So this was in a sense a policy in which the fuzziness of the white category that Tom describes could be utilized in order to bring in whoever the authorities really wanted at any particular time into the category of whiteness. This is, I think, a very powerful framing or analysis of how white supremacy has worked, not just through the absolute separation of different groups, but through the inconsistency of inclusion and exclusion from the category of whiteness. So I do have one question that emerges at this point. According to the Selective Training and Service Act, there were, as I said, those 5 categories. But one question that emerges out of this logic is, as well as in the census, is that there's no category for Mexicans or Latin Americans, Latinx, more broadly. So they're just automatically included in the white category. And I don't know the historical origin of that kind of whiteness. It put the census records in a kind of unusual, or give us some unusual statistics about the census, which is that the Japanese were actually supposed to be the second largest minority besides black people in the United States at the time of the 1940 census, because all the Mexicans, Latin Americans were folded into the white category. So that's one question. What about the category of Mexican? Why they're automatically white, at least in principle in these categorizations? But then if you look at the census itself, which came out at just around the same time, there's no category in the census of Oriental or Yellow or Mongoloid, all of which are terms used in this period. But Asians are divided up by national or even colonial origin. So the second kind of question, in addition to the one about Mexicans, is why so many micro categories for Asians? And my sense, I'm not sure about this, is because the logic of color is complicated by the logic of empire. Who would stand in the way of or be an ally in American imperialism in Asia? But again, I'm not sure. And another kind of possibility is, or is it the way that the Asian could be placed in a kind of racialized industrial reserve army so that they could be turned as white enough to be allowed to immigrate for labor purposes at certain points in time? So what are the effects of this bewildering tripartite structure of white, black, and non-black minorities? And Tom went over this a bit in his remarks. The radical abjection of blacks in the white-black binary made it possible for non-black minorities to sometimes be included, but not completely. And this is another good point that Tom makes, never completely in the white category. This is an important observation for a number of reasons, including helping us to understand that what we could call the kind of inclusionary racism, vis-a-vis Asian people did not necessarily mean the end of racism against them. As I sometimes say, Asian people like me are sometimes white, but never quite. As Tom points out, the limited fuzziness of the boundary between white and Black minorities could also deflate the possibility of cross-racial solidarities between Blacks and non-Black minorities. So, and we do see that in our own communities where people would want to racialize minorities, non-Black minorities might want to disidentify with Blackness in order to lift themselves up, a racial uplift on the backs of Black people, and then also later on brown people and so on. And while that might seem like something that happens from within the communities, I think what Tom is really pointing out is that it stems from this logic, this crazy logic of white supremacy that disenables that kind of cross-racial solidarity. This observation has great import for our current moment, I think, because as we face the ongoing and even intensifying racisms against Black, Brown, Asian, and Muslim communities, as well as others, it's important to realize that we are actually all on the darker side of the color line, but not in exactly the same way. And so I think the jury is still out on this concept of this phrasing of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. But I think it reflects some sort of genuine desire on the part of a younger generation to try and understand how Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are different, but linked together in some kind of way against white supremacy. But what I'm trying to say with regard to Tom's book is that it really shows us historically through this very in-depth research, how, not only all the interesting vignettes and so forth with which you started out, but there's a structure to this white racism that we need to confront. This also means, in my view, that we need to work harder as communities of color to build those kinds of alliances among non-Black minorities with Black people and Indigenous peoples. And this is, of course, one of the projects which is really important these days, showing the kind of connections, beginning really with Du Bois, who talked about the alliances and the entanglements of Asian and Black peoples, but goes through up to our present day through a wide range of peoples. I don't have that much time, so I won't mention them all here. I think I'm running short of time, so I just want to skip over some things that I had wanted to talk about. But one other issue is I'm really glad that Tom showed the evolving structure of racism over time, and even to some extent a kind of cyclical nature going backward in time. It's not necessarily a progress narrative. There were times at which I thought, oh, Tom is going in the direction of a progress narrative. Things are starting to get better and better. But then he pulls us back and says, actually, it's not. It's not. And we live with the consequences, the aftermath of all of this, even in our present day. The final question that I would pose, because I don't have time to talk about everything else I want to talk about, is here and there you mentioned the masculinist bond among soldiers of color and white soldiers as well. And I wonder if you want to talk about that. I'm remembering Susan Jeffords' book on Vietnam War narratives and the ways in which this masculinist bond was a way of overcoming racial ethnic divisions. But the price for that is, of course, and doesn't exclude men of color, is a kind of misogyny towards women. So, but I'll end there.
Thank you so much. Tom, did you want to respond to some of those remarks?
Sure, and thanks so much, Takashi, for those great remarks. And as I told you before we were live, your book was so foundational for me in so many ways. So it's especially great to have a chance to talk with you about my book here. So a lot of questions. I'll try to tackle a few of them here. So on this question about Mexican Americans and their whiteness, there's a long story there. In some ways dating back to the end of the Mexican American War, when folks of Mexican descent are now incorporated into the United States and granted citizenship status. And then there are naturalization cases where they are granted whiteness and allowed to naturalize, unlike Asian immigrants and others. And there's a long, complex story about Mexican American racialization, part of which I've written a bit about it myself. But in terms of the military, I mean, I think it's very much in the state's interests, the military's interests and the federal government's interests to keep Mexican Americans within the white fold during World War II, in part because of the good neighbor policy and the alliance between the United States and Mexico. And so, I tell a story, not in this book, but years ago, about a law that was passed in Texas that attempted at the state level in Texas to protect the quote Caucasian rights of Mexican Americans, and this was something at the state level that the U.S. government was very, very active in trying to promote, just as they were very active within the selective service and within the military, attempting to kind of squelch any efforts to kind of separate Mexican Americans from the white category, right? Because you do see that happening. Draft boards, for example, not sending Mexican Americans in when there's a certain call for white people. There are people in the Southwest or something who say, well, you didn't ask for Mexican Americans, so we're not going to send them. And the federal government steps in and says, no, hey, wait a minute, they're white too. So there's this kind of top-down effort that, again, I saw in my previous research on Texas. There's this top-down effort to kind of shore up the whiteness of Mexican Americans, in part, I think, because of foreign policy imperatives. And I would say in some ways, as your work shows, that's part of the story with regard to the unwillingness of the federal government, the U.S. federal government during the war to ever create this one grand Asian racial category, right? Because, Filipinos are fighting with the United States, Chinese are fighting with the United States. I think I quote in the book this telegram from the Secretary of State to newspapers and radio shows saying, hey, there's a lot of talk about the yellow race and the brown race as kind of encapsulating all of Asians, and that's really unhelpful for our war effort here. We're very much focused on trying to make these finer distinctions so our allies will continue to support the broader war effort. So I think that's part of what's happening in terms of these selective service and military racial categories. Inclusionary racism against Asian Americans, I have in my notes. Yes, I mean, I think, there's a section at the end of the book where I talk about the rise of this nascent model minority idea. So, and I kind of talk about how the celebration of Japanese American soldiers in the spring of 45 in particular, when they're fighting alongside African Americans, this celebration is so often in direct contrast with a denigration of African American soldiers that those two stories need to be told together and haven't, as far as I can tell, before. And so, for example, you have these segregationists, Jim Crow segregationists in Congress, kind of promoting Japanese American heroism during the war, not to improve the lot of Asian Americans in the United States, but to protect Jim Crow in the United States. In fact, they're kind of saying, hey, Japanese Americans were segregated. They didn't have a problem with it, wrongly they stated, and they performed heroically. And so this is something that African Americans should do as well. Again, they're doing that to denigrate African Americans, not to promote Japanese Americans in this case. And so there's an inclusion, but it's all in the service of a broader set of racist hierarchies, in my view. I'm really glad you mentioned this point about conditions disabling the opportunity for solidarity, because that's a big part of what I'm attempting to show is, or one thing I'm attempting to show is the ways in which the structure of the US military, these competing, crisscrossing color lines, made it so difficult for people to kind of find common cause, because depending on the time, depending on the context, their interests might be in line or might not be. And so it was just so debilitating for any effort to think more broadly, and not just as, say, people of color, but as workers, as Americans, as veterans, or whatever. Any mass movements, I argue, really paid a price for this in the post-war years. I mean, we need to remember that the US military during the war was 16 million people strong. 12% of the US population was in uniform during World War II. And so the stories I tell, I believe, had a profound effect on post-war America. And one of the profound effects had to do with this kind of fracturing of the American people that I think made it more difficult for people to organize across some of these divides that the military spent so much time enforcing.
Thank you very much. Before we get to our next discussant, let me remind folks, if you have questions, you can use the raise hand function that allows us to call on you and unmute you so you can address us directly. You can also use the question and answer function on Zoom as well. We have a number of questions in the queue already. If you change your mind and you actually want to pose the question yourself, just raise your hand and we will do our best to call on you, okay? Thank you. Our second discussant today is Adrienne Lentz-Smith, who is Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Duke University. She's also Associate Chair of the Duke History Department. She holds a BA in History from Harvard Radcliffe and a PhD in History from Yale University. The author of Freedom Struggles, African Americans and World War I, published by Harvard University Press in 2009. She has also published articles in Southern Cultures, Modern American History, and the American Quarterly. Her most recent essay is The Unbearable Whiteness of Grand Strategy that appeared in the edited collection, Rethinking American Grand Strategy, published by Oxford in 2021, a book that we featured in this seminar not too long ago. Adrienne, the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me, Tom. Thank you for this book. I am really delighted to be part of this panel. To paraphrase Jerry Reed in Smokey and the Bandit, we have a long way to go and a short time to get there. There are a lot of questions in the queue, so I will try to be as succinct as I am capable of being. That said, I actually start my formal remarks by saying that I had two introductions to them, and in this time of COVID and Zoom, can't make choices anymore. And so I'm going to do both. But as we were talking, I also had two other thoughts. So now I have two prefaces and two introductions, but I'm committed to being succinct. One, by way of preface, I'll just say that as I was listening to everyone talk, I was thinking about the fact that Colin Powell passed away today, that news has been all over the news. And of course, he was a child during World War I. He was born, World War II. He was born in 1937, but I'm struck very much by the fact that the military that he came up through was made possible by the struggles, the resistances, the what have you that happened during World War II. And I'm also struck by the way that his commitment to the military as an institution and his insistence on not foregrounding his racial identity is a product of not going deep into the kind of narratives that Tom has us think through and think about. So that's preface one. Preface two, Takashi, I was just thinking as you were talking that the categories that are pulled out in the SDSA in 1940, you're right? It's Filipino, Native American. And it is about the history of I think of US empire on the sort of in the continental US and beyond. And I'm also very struck by those two categories, especially Native Americans or Indians in the parlance and Filipinos, are people whom previous Black troops or Black troops in the regular army were responsible for being the kind of advance guard or the sort of like the men on the ground, the soldiers on the ground in pushing the US state and imperial project. That these are the very folks, like African Americans were trying to cement their citizenship or their sense of belonging in the nation by extending the reach of American empire, thus intensifying the kind of dynamics that would make it harder to fight white supremacy, more broadly speaking. Prefaces. I'm going to go to my intro, and then I'll go to my questions. So the first version of an intro to my remarks is to bring up something that anyone who's talked to me for more than a few minutes has probably heard me talk about, which is that at some point in my life, I really wanted to write an article or something bigger on Magnum PI and the social meaning of the Vietnam War. That is to say that I spent a lot of time, I actually have a Mr. T, well, I guess that's A-T, but I have a Tom Selleck pillow downstairs. I spent a lot of time watching and thinking about Magnum PI when I was procrastinating on my dissertation. And one of the things that repeatedly struck me was the way that they took this kind of combo of friends, the sort of unremarkable white guy, Magnum, the ethnic white guy, Rick, and the Black guy, TC. And the explanation for how they could all be friends in Hawaii was Nam, right? That in this period in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when people couldn't make sense of what they thought Vietnam might have meant for America militarily, right? Or in terms of foreign policy, they could at least agree that the fraternity of men had eased some of the social tensions of the 1960s. I said this to someone at some point who said, well, you realize that's just a variation on the World War II movie story, right? That's always, it's the sort of the unit that has the ethnic whites and the regular whites and maybe some person who's a little bit brown of somewhere. And World War II in that storytelling as a cradle of civic nationalism, right? Those kind of World War II stories don't acknowledge the divisions that make that performance or repetition of that narrative necessary. I think we could have the same conversation about Hogan's Heroes in a way that Hogan Heroes is both World War II and Vietnam, and a completely insane and deeply distasteful setup, but I'll save that for another day. Instead, I'll just say that Divisions as a book adds a layer of understanding to help us understand why folks reached for narratives in World War II that those war stories, those are sort of stories of fraternization and civic nationalism, why people reach for them as a palliative, even as the book highlights how inadequate those palliatives were for addressing the underlying conditions. Another way of walking into my comments is to say that I've been thinking a lot lately about Dan Sharfstein's quote in his book, The Invisible Line, a book that's about the history of race making and racial classification by looking at families who crossed the color line. In The Invisible Line, Sharfstein writes that race is not just a set of rules. It's also a set of stories that people have told themselves and one another over and over again. Some are rooted in day-to-day living and hard-won experience, he goes on to say, while others derive from hope and despair. Divisions explores how race as a set of rules and collections of stories gets built into US institutions and gets continually remade through experience, hard fought and hard won. The book supplies a counter to the wistful, and again, sort of largely fictional pop culture invocation of the World War II era military as a fraternity of the forces for good or as a crucible of civic nationalism. If unity remains the primary focus of World War II narratives in pop culture and popular history, this book instead traces the military's complex color lines between Black and white and the panoply of other races not Black, but decidedly not or conditionally not white. Through this, the book examines the military not just as a structure of white domination, but as a dynamic and contingent structure of Black subordination and other non-white subordination too, to use Tom's delightfully clear explanation. As a thoughtful, nuanced history of war and society, the book doesn't treat the two fields, war and society, as distinct. Rather, it takes them as overlapping and mutually constitutive. As he writes, the military didn't simply borrow civilian ideas and practices, it also actively made and remade its own. So I really, really like this book, and not just because it has a gorgeous cover and because nobody else has shown it, I'm going to, because it is so, so very striking. Yeah, exactly. Now you get a sort of double vision of the cover. I like it because it navigates the voluminous body of literature on World War II without getting bogged down in it and without getting bogged down in vindicationist histories of one group or another at war. It places the experience of Black Americans alongside or in dialogue with those of Japanese Americans and other non or less white Americans. It talks about racism and the resistance to it without reifying the racial categories, multiple racisms, cross-cutting color lines and the ways that people built, blurred, or outright challenged those lines. Few books do this sort of consistently and extensively because it's really, really hard to do. It's hard to keep all of these parts moving. But in Divisions, by centering race and racism as dynamic, socially and contextually constructed and relational, even when its practitioners are not thinking relationally, the book offers a clear-eyed view of white supremacy at work in US society and the American military. It also offers an astute and convincing analysis of how myriad people and peoples shaped the US state and were shaped by it. As much as racism, it's a book about resistance, reformulations, and using wedges to make openings. This all sounds really abstract, right? It sounds sort of like general and up here. But the other thing that I think is really remarkable about this book is that it does it very concretely. Divisions roots its important conceptual work in prodigious and attentive research and attention to the lived experience of its subjects in recruitment, assignment, service at home and abroad, and in return. Its focus on the everyday experiences and decision-making tempers the tendency for white supremacy to become a flat meta-narrative. That is to say that the book supplies accounts that tell of dynamism alongside incalcitrance, their positions held, defended, rethought, or reimagined, their strategies deployed, reconsidered, and returned to. And perhaps most striking, it offers a window into white supremacy as insistently broad in its appeal and sometimes wildly unsystematic in its practice. In focusing on people of color, to use a phrase that for better or worse captures the imprecision of racial categories then and now, or we might say BIPOC to sort of follow the young folk, to focus on their variety of responses to the variegations of white supremacy in the military, the book also illustrates how folks push racial thinking to evolve. In many ways, it's become a truism to say that World War II bequeathed the mid-century mass movement, but by giving the reader a round view of the freedom struggles that shaped the World War II military, the book restores some of the revelation to that observation, more convincingly, I think, than it's sometimes done. It also suggests connections to non-white people's later manifestations of activism. This is otherwise to say this book is smart in a big abstract way. It's grounded in a way that sort of speaks to my sort of grumpy archival nerd's heart. It manages to drive home the fact that the line between Black folks and races other than Negro remained the most entrenched, with some of the most dogmatic and deadly policing, while avoiding assertions of exceptionality that might divorce the racialization and subordination of Black people from other forms of white domination. Instead, by examining the multiple kinds of racialized experiences, the book sheds light on how race gets made in concert and in contrast, and also the contingent nature of that making. Again, I'll repeat, I just like this book so much. Right, I'm delighted that it is in the world, and I thank you for putting in the long, hard work of writing it. I have a couple of questions. They're super open-ended, and if we'd rather move to the Q&A, you can pretend like I didn't ask them and just sweep this and go on. One is just, and I think I've posed this to you in a different context, is the question of anti-fascism and if it just has no bearing on the World War II story, or not a meaningful bearing on the World War II story. That, you know, my survey used to be World War II was when white supremacy became a bad word. It could be that maybe the slogan itself lost some legitimacy, but what does it matter? So maybe my question then is, does it matter that Americans, white Americans, moved away from naming what they were doing, but doubled down on doing it, right? So how do we think about that? And then my other question is one about, like, what is whiteness by the end of this war? And how do we see its evolution affecting the period that comes next? I'm really struck, as I'm trying to make my lectures for my civil rights movement class a little more fluid than they have been, about how many veterans you see on both sides, right? When you're looking at the movement. And maybe that's just because, as you said, the war involved so many people, but I do think that Jim Crow's defenders also have a sense that they fought hard for something and they're not going to let it go easily. And I wonder whether that isn't tied to how the military structured these lines and enforce and entrench them. That's it.
Thank you. Tom, do you want to take a quick crack at these questions?
Sure. First, I also want to thank you, Adrian, so much for being here today and for your engagement with my work for so long. Your book, Freedom Struggles, was a model for me, you know, in elegance and intelligence, and a model for, what do you say in the introduction, telling a story through war, not of war. So I've learned so much from you, and thanks for being here. I'm gonna just respond to that last point first, I think, and then maybe I'll get a chance to talk about anti-fascism. But you know, this never made it into the book, but it was part of a book proposal many years ago. But you know, Medgar Evers and the man who took his life, Byron de la Beckwith, were both World War II veterans. And I think that fact perfectly captures some of the complexity of the final chapter of my book. And I hope the complexity of the entire book, right, is the way in which the military is discharging soldiers with a very complex mix of messages. You know, as I said, in just summarizing some of that at the end of my remarks, right, on the one hand, it taught some people that America you know, fell so far short of its ideals, and yet there was need to kind of close that gap. And there were people who were newly energized, folks of all racial designations, newly energized to fight that fight. On the other hand, there were people who were more invested in white supremacy than ever before, or at the very least equally. You know, the military did nothing to kind of mitigate their white supremacist commitments. If anything, it strengthened them. And so what you have at the end of the war is this kind of this inevitable massive showdown between these kind of competing forces. Evers on the one hand, de la Beckwith on the other, among many other people, of course, you know. In terms of whiteness at the end of the war, you know, on the one hand, I think the simple answer is that, and this doesn't get a ton of attention in my book, I don't talk a lot about the white ethnics, you know, the Italians and Poles and Jews who the whiteness literature says, and I claim in my original book, you know, are most comfortably, most unequivocally white by the war years, you know, that there's more acceptance than ever before, even if they were, in my view, kind of were accepted as white by the institutions that mattered from the very get-go. There were questions throughout, and those questions kind of dissolved by the war years. So for example, on naturalization applications, for example, you used to have all immigrants have to fill out race and color, right? And race would have been, say, South Italian or North Italian, and color was white. By the war years, those two questions were actually collapsed into one. And I think it speaks to the ways in which some of these intra-European racial divisions that were really salient for decades now are not so much. So part of this, I don't really tell that story because the argument, the evidence I see, just there's never really any questions about where Italians fit with regard to, say, the white non-white line. But in any case, I do think there's a kind of a further cementing of that category. And then you've got these kind of what I'm calling non-Black minorities who are kind of in and out a little bit, but in a way that just makes things complicated, but doesn't settle anything in the post-war years. And again, I think, to my earlier point, just lays the table, sets the table for vigorous struggle down the road.
Thank you. All right, question and answers, discussion. We have a hand up from Sonia Michelle, a friend of the seminar and the Wilson Center. Sonia, please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Okay, I try. Oh, okay.
Yes, you're on.
I'm on. Okay, but have I unmuted? Oh,
Yes,
okay.
you have.
Yeah.
I can't see myself. Okay. My question is related to one of the ones that Adrian raised, and also some of the comments that Tom just made. And that is when Adrian was talking about the ways in which anti-fascism affected the ways of thinking about race. I'm just wondering whether anyone at the time talked about the relationship between Nazi ideology, which was, of course, extremely racialized, and white supremacy. And if so, did that, excuse the pun, in any way? I mean, Tom just said that by the time of the war, Poles, Italians, and Jews had all reached white, quote, white status. But I wonder if Nazi ideology had an impact on that and differentiated Jews from the other white ethnic groups.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think unquestionably the Holocaust, or what would become known as the Holocaust, absolutely played a role in this consolidating of whiteness around some of these European groups. But in terms of, yeah, and then back to Adrian's question about anti-fascism, there's no question that, yes, civil rights activists were incredibly savvy about the uses that they could put anti-fascism to. They were, fully aware of all the kind of opportunities that were available to them now that the US was fighting Nazis, and all of a sudden racism was supposedly very much opposed to our stated war aims. So this was something that, say, African-American civil rights activists were constantly pointing out the hypocrisies here. But to Adrian's point, that didn't mean that, and military leaders were obviously aware of some of these uncomfortable kind of parallels, but it didn't prevent them from still acting in white supremacist ways and instantiating policies that were, were racist. But they were savvy. They could do things that didn't appear to be, I think in some ways we think of the post-civil rights era as a time when racism had to become a little bit more covert, had to become a little bit more complex, a little less explicit, a little less in your face. There's some of that happening in the World War II years as well, in part because of anti-fascism.
Thank you. Steve Lipsum has a hand up. Unmute yourself and pose a question, Steve.
Hi, thank you. I was interested to know, how much, you're looking at racism in the military, how much a South non-South divide played in. Were the military leaders who were more willing to relax the color line towards the end? Were they more likely Northern and the others more likely Southern? And similarly with the African American troops who fought, who resisted, did whether they resist or how they resist vary based on whether they were South or not South, or their socioeconomic status or other factors? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. Did it matter? Yeah, I mean, to answer quickly, it did matter for sure. I'll just give you a couple examples of the way it mattered. So, but I also want to just underline the fact that I don't want to overstate how much it mattered. So I think one common explanation for racism in the military involves the prevalence of Southern white officers. And I think there's some truth to that. Honestly, I never really make that statement explicitly or repeatedly, because I think it only goes so far. I mean, you had, and I think it undersells the way in which racism within the military, again, was so broad sweeping. Just speaking in terms of leaders' investments, it transcended region. So for example, just to give you one example, Henry Stimson is from the North. He's the Secretary of War during the war, and he's every bit as committed to segregation as our generals from the South, or officers below them. So I don't want to overstate that argument, but it's absolutely there. And I'll just give you some examples of the way in which it's there. So I have a chapter that talks about, and I reference this in my remarks, I have a chapter about the ways in which the military defined inductees racially, right? Because if you have a military that is determined to have Black units and white unit, what they call Black units and white units, or what they call Negro and colored units on the one hand, and everyone else units on the other, you have to have a way of deciding who goes where. And this is a really complicated question, and a very contentious question in certain cases. And it really forces the military to decide how is it that they're going to make these determinations. And what I find is that many of the chapter revolves around a number of controversies where the military attempts to induct somebody as often as not white, and or as Black, I should say. And the inductee says, well, hold it, wait a minute, I'm not Black, I'm something else. And some of these, and many of these cases happened in the South. It was clear that Southern states and individuals at the ground level in Southern states were much more deeply invested in policing, very strictly policing the white-Black line. So for example, I tell the story of someone in Maine. There's a selective service official in Maine who writes to the War Department and says, we actually now know that somebody that we sent to the white military has an African-American grandparent or something, and we don't want them to go into the Black military because they were always accepted in our community as white, but in any case, you should just know this. And the military is like, that's okay. And the people from Maine, again, were very flexible on the issue. Folks in Virginia, North Carolina, Louisiana, in so many cases were not flexible on the issue. They really believed strongly in the kind of one-drop rule, and did not want to, if they believed that certain people in their community were Black, they did not want to have them in the white military and come back to the South as people thinking differently about themselves and perhaps differently about their futures in the region. So anyway, that's just one example, but there are other examples of where those regional differences matter. Many of the camps where service members are training are located in the South. And so that's another way in which region really matters. Although again, it's not as if Northern camps didn't have some of the same racist lines that Southern camps did. So it's complicated, but that just gives you a little bit of a sense.
Thank you. Donald Rogers has a hand up. If you would unmute, you can pose a question. Go
Thank you
ahead.
for taking my question. I'm wondering if there's any relationship between movements for racial equality in the civilian world and the activism that occurred in the military.
Thank you. Yes, there are lots of connections. So just to give you an example, so the NAACP, for example, is very, very interested in what's happening in the military and is constantly working as best they can to support these civil rights struggles happening within the military. as I briefly mentioned in my remarks, there are service members who are energetically fighting for a more democratic military, energetically fighting to erase many of the color lines that ensnare them. And all along the way, they're receiving lots of help from people on the outside. So formal civil rights organizations like the NAACP, as I mentioned, among others, the March on Washington movement, this new organizations that emerge in part in support of Winfred Lynn, for example, but also labor unions, religious groups, family members, moms, mothers of soldiers. I was struck, in the archive seeing one letter after another signed by a Negro mother, a worried Negro mother. Motherhood becomes this really important politicized identity during the war and becomes an avenue through which some African-American women are able to kind of make claims on the state. So yes, countless connections between the civilian world and the civilian world and civil rights struggles happening within the military.
I would just add that both a chapter in the book on this and your earlier piece in the Journal of American History are masterpieces at both delineating the civil rights dimension of the military experience and its connection to the civil rights dimension on the domestic scene. So a very compelling set of stories and arguments that you advance in the article and in the chapter. We have a question from Alex Lichtenstein, who would like you to explain the rationale for the Selective Service Law's non-discrimination clause. Why was it passed? Did white Southern senators speak against it? Was it a threatened a filibuster? Was it seen all along as rhetorical rather than enforceable? So why did it pass? Why didn't the Dixiecrats try to stop it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alex. Thanks. So I think, when there were debates within Congress, sorry, my kids are joining the conversation. When there were debates in Congress about this clause in particular, well, obviously debates about and discussions about the Draft Act. Within that, there were conversations about this particular clause, as you can imagine. Southern Democrats really were concerned about segregation. They wanted to be reassured that the authors of this clause were not attempting to dismantle segregation and would not be able to through this clause. And so some of its sponsors, like Wagner from New York, has to, explicitly say, hey, this is not about desegregation. This is about just protecting certain civil rights of Black soldiers. So that seems to be the way in which it gets passed. It's also, of course, yes. So I mean, I think so it gets passed. And then people like Winfred Lynn actually challenge the significance of this clause, the meaning of this clause, the reach of this clause. And there are lots of debates in his camp about how to attack it. So there are people like Dwight McDonald and other leftists who really believe that if the military can desegregate, this will be a boon for labor and leftist organizing, that this will help workers across color lines to kind of unite. And so they're very invested in desegregation and feel like Winfred Lynn's case can in fact do this. But when they actually reach the courts, they come up with a much more a narrower, more modest approach, because they really feel like, in line with what the Dixiecrats in Congress thought during deliberations over this bill, Winfred Lynn's supporters really thought, well, those folks are right, actually. This clause can't desegregate the military, but perhaps what it can do is raise questions about the constitutionality of separate draft quotas, right? Because the draft, this Selective Service Act, said that that your draft number determines when you are picked in the draft. But as it turns out, as the Winfred Lynn case revealed very clearly, in fact, it had to do with two things. It had to do with your number and it had to do with your race, because there were separate, there was a separate sequencing for each, for white and for colored. Anyway, all of this to say that to get back to your question, I think white Southerners kind of were okay with this because they were convinced, and they were right about it. They were convinced that this would have no bearing on the broader segregationist structure of the US military.
Michael Goodman, if you would unmute, you can pose a question.
Yes, my question is about, I believe on the home front, there were two riots, one in Detroit, one in New York in 1943. I believe that race and possibly service personnel were involved in both. Could you say something about those two incidents? Thanks.
Sure. So there were lots of incidents. There were hundreds of race riots on the home front during World War II. There were the Zoot Suit riots, of course, in Los Angeles in 1943. There was one in Detroit. There was one in Harlem, as you mentioned, and countless other places, and not just in the United States, but also overseas among service members. And yes, many of them did have to do with service members. So, for example, the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles involved white sailors oftentimes attacking Mexican Americans. In Detroit, there were white service members involved there as well, and I think some black service members as well. In the case of Harlem, I believe it started, and folks can correct me if I'm wrong here, but my memory is it started because of an attack on an African American mom, and a soldier objected to it, and things. I could be corrected on that one, but again, there's just the boundary between military and civilian is so porous at this time. You see it in so many different instances, and you absolutely see it with regard to some of this violence on the home front and overseas during the war.
Thank you. Perhaps the last question from two questions here. Jennifer Guglielmo has a question. So Tom, maybe you want to respond. Jennifer,
I think I've
please
heard
unmute. There we go.
Congratulations, Tom, on this monumental achievement. It's just been such an honor to, I'm Tom's sister, I should say first, and also historian. And I just want, on behalf of all the Guglielmos in attendance, just send you much love, and we're all in awe of you and the work that you do. I wanted to, Andrew and I are here watching, and we had a question about how folks within the military addressed grievances, if there was a system or a process by which soldiers could fight within the system, right, to address racist incidents and procedures. And because Andrew was thinking about what it meant for the military to try and maintain morale of soldiers.
In the context of fighting, a force overseas and in the Pacific. So how's morale sort of maintained, and were there any kind of boards that were set up to look at any of those kind of things?
Thanks, guys, and thanks for those kind words. Yeah, I mean, I think there were opportunities to appeal for change through the system, as you say. So, and sometimes it works. So I argue that for non-Black minority troops, sometimes they actually got more attention from their white officers when it came to addressing racism that they faced, either outside of the military or inside it. Sometimes, interestingly, they received more attention when they were in descent-specific units, right? So if Filipino Americans are facing racism in Fresno, California, and can't get their hair cut, sometimes white officers were much more willing to address those issues because it affected everybody in their unit. Whereas if you had a kind of one or two Filipinos sprinkled in a larger white outfit, they were less concerned about it and less focused on it. I'll say one other thing, because I see we're at 5:30 here, but you had to be careful very, very careful though. So Isaac McNatt, I think of Isaac McNatt's story, who is in an engineering battalion in the Navy, CV, construction battalion, excuse me, in the Navy. And his commanding officer at one point, when I think they're in Trinidad, Andrew, says, hey, clearly you guys are unhappy with some of the racist restrictions that you're under. He didn't quite put it that way, but we're happy to talk about it. Let's have an honest conversation. Let's kind of clear the air and try to address some of these issues. And so they do. They kind of lay out all their various concerns, that they can't get promoted, that there's kind of rampant segregation, not just when they were training in the South, but then when they moved to Trinidad to serve there. And they have this kind of spirited conversation. It seems like it all went fine, but then the next thing you know, they're all being discharged dishonorably, and no one ever tells them why. And so there were, needless to say, there were so many kind of dangers involved in kind of working through the system, even if sometimes it worked.
Thank you. And alas, I have the unfortunate task of now having to draw this to a close. We've scratched the surface of what is a very rich and very readable book. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, anyone who still reads, the Tom Brokaw Greatest Generation or any of the other celebratory works really must read this work alongside it. It is a sobering, powerful, and moving book. And with that, I want to thank Tom, Adrian, Takashi, Christian, and apologies to those of you still with questions that we were not able to get to. With that, I hand this back to you, Christian, for final remarks.
Thanks, Eric. What a terrific panel. Please join us this coming Monday, October 25th, for a discussion of Ben Young's new book, Guns, Guerrillas, and the Great Leader, North Korea and the Third World. Again, thanks to Tom, Adrian, Takashi, and Eric. Wonderful, rich conversation. We're adjourned. Stay safe and good night.